My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Many of us have experienced coincidence and synchronicity, but when a medical doctor, the former chairman of the psychiatry department of a major university medical school, recognizes these experiences, they become meaningful coincidences. My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Dr. Bernard Beitman, clarifies the relationship between synchronicity and serendipity and dissects the anatomy of coincidence. He's the first psychiatrist since Carl Jung to systematize the study of coincidences. His website is coincider.com, and he joins me this week to share his work and new book, Meaningful Coincidences: How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited Dr. Bernard Beitman. Welcome, Bernie.
Hey, thanks a lot, Victor. Good to hear your voice.
And thank you for joining us and sharing this very interesting and very important message with us today. So let's start with your personal experience in life. What was there that happened that led you to study this specific field?
I've had a series of coincidences throughout my life. The most meaningful happened when I was 8 or 9, and it was meaningful because it was my first one, and it stayed with me ever since and got me started on the road that has led us to go along here together with you.
And tell us a little more about that, please.
This was Shaker Heights, Ohio. I came home from school on my bicycle, and as I said, I was about 8 or 9, and I said, "Hey, Ma, where's Snapper?" And that's what they let me call him, my dog, Snapper. And my mother said, "I don't know. Maybe you should go to the police station. Maybe they know." So I got back on my bike, went back over to the elementary school, went over the blacktop, over the grass, and there was this big road that the police station was on the other side of, Van Aken. And I'd never crossed that road before, but I wanted to find Snapper. So I crossed the road and parked my bike below the stairs, climbed up some stairs, then a little walkway, some more stairs all outside, opened the big door, walked in, and there was a big desk and a big man sitting behind the desk. And I looked at him and said, "Have you seen my dog?" He said, "Sorry, son, I have not seen your dog." I turned around and I was crying and crying. I loved that dog so much, Snapper. He was my best friend, probably my only friend. We used to go in the back of the garage and sniff ketchup and mayonnaise jars together. And I needed him. And I walked back down the little stairs and north stairs and got to the bottom, got on my bike. And I was crying so much, I didn't think to go back across the big street. Instead, I went right and was pedaling along and pedaling along. I looked up. What? There's a dog coming towards me that looks like the way Snapper walks. It is Snapper. It is Snapper. It is Snapper. So I was so happy to see him. And he jumped up on my leg as if to say, "What took you so long?" Well, that was a major coincidence for me to make the wrong turn and find the right person, the person I was looking for. He got lost and I got lost. And that's one of the basic ideas of coincidences, is that you can find a lot of them when your regular reality gets changed. The structure is removed somehow, and then new possibilities open up, just like this one.
What do you think what role do you think your mother had to play in this?
Thank you for that, Victor. Uh, she's gone, so I didn't have a chance to ask her. But I thought at first, I mean, when I thought about it, that it was pretty clever of her to disavow her responsibility enough for me to go look to somebody else for it. So I thought it got her off the hook. But she was also a German refugee from the Holocaust. In 1933, she left Germany. Uh, and I think she might have thought that the German police knew everything about everybody. So she figured maybe they knew something about where my dog was.
I got it. I got it. You refer to yourself as a recovering academic. Now, let me just share with our audience. Dr. Beitman has been it started with chemistry, I believe, in your undergraduate work.
Yeah.
Became a medical doctor and then specialized in psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
Was the chairman of a psychiatric department for more than 17 years.
Mm-hmm.
Why recovering academic?
Well, let me go back to Snapper and then I'll come back to that question. I had to try to figure out how it happened that Snapper and I found each other. So I came up with the idea of an internal GPS system in human beings and in animals. This human GPS gets us to where we need to be without knowing how we're getting there. It's an intuitive kind of thing. It's more than that, but it's a simple way of saying it. So I began to find lots of examples of this internal GPS in other stories people told me. So it became an idea that I have presented to the people who want to read my book on a chapter on this, what I would call it their human GPS. Internal GPS is another name for it. And so I'm bringing to the world's population of people interested in coincidences the idea that we have inside of us an internal GPS that we can activate under times of need and stress. Now, that idea is not particularly congruent with the way modern science and modern medicine thinks of itself. So I had gotten to a place in medicine, within the medical community, within which I was reaching outside of the regularly thought up ideas that I was being taught, and I was in part teaching psychiatric residents. So I'm still recovering from having spent 46 years in academia, where the materialistic view of the mind and brain has held forth, namely that maybe mind is not a product of the brain. Maybe there's something else going on here. And that's what coincidences help me to discover, what's going on out here in reality that regular science will not permit to be accepted within it.
I will share a quick story, a personal story.
Please
in
do.
1975, I was in the Air Force. I was stationed in South Korea. And one morning, I woke up and I had a message that something was wrong with mom. No one told me anything. I hadn't received any word, just an inner feeling that something was wrong with my mother back in New York. So I called, and back in those days, we had extension phones, wired extension phones. And my mother and my sister simultaneously picked the phone. And I said, Mom, what's wrong? And my sister said, oh my God, how did he find out? And it turned out that she was going in for major surgery the next day. And immediately when she shared that with me, I said, Mom, it's going to be a complete success. You're going to have a full recovery. Everything's going to be fine. It reassured her and brought her comfort. The fact that she and I connected, so there were no secrets going on. And sure enough, she had that procedure done, and she had a full recovery, and everything was fine after that. So again, you talked about that internal GPS. This is almost like an internal messaging system.
Exactly. And I'm glad we waited for you to tell me this story, Victor. Because the next major influence on my interest in coincidences was something like what you just described. I was in San Francisco in 1973 in a Victorian house in the Fillmore district at 11 p.m., February 26th, uncontrollably choking and not being able to stop the choking. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop it. It's 11 p.m. San Francisco time. The next day, my brother called me and said that our father in Wilmington, Delaware, had died at 2 a.m. East Coast time, which is the same as my 11 p.m. West Coast time. He died of choking on his own blood. So something like what you experienced, I experienced a parallel feeling of that my father was feeling around the same time. What you experienced with your mother and what I experienced with my father, I had to ask, and I did research, asking people in a controlled way. We created a survey called the Weird Coincidence Survey, asking them, do you ever have the feeling of something going on with a loved one who is at a distance from you? And the answer was like, sometimes. I mean, you don't want this happening all the time, but it's sometimes. So this was not an uncommon experience, but I didn't know that. So I had to do the research and do some reading to see that what you were able to do, connect with the discomfort of your mother, and I was able to do is connect with the actual physical experience of my father. I call that simulpathity. Simulpathity meaning simultaneous feeling at a distance.
And these connections can be either mental or physical, correct?
Absolutely. And in fact, you're hitting the right idea. The original definition of telepathy was tele at a distance, pathy, feeling. So feeling the pain of a loved one at a distance was the original definition of telepathy, which has now become more mental, which is what yours partly was. But you didn't have just a mental thing. You had an intuitive, emotional thing as well.
As what many people refer to as a gut feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah. What's down there? What do we have connected down there that brings us those messages?
Well, the connection that I'd prefer to ask about is not so much within our body, because I'm not sure how much it's gut, although gut sometimes is recognized as being the second brain of the body. It's got a lot of neurons running around there between the intestines and among the intestines. So there is some kind of brain-like activity going on in the gut. And people who understand yoga and understand chakras are well aware of the bodily representations that come out of the chakra related to the intestines. What I'd rather mention to you is that we have the ability to connect with other people in ways that we don't believe are true. That is telepathy, as you might call it, or simulpathity, as I might. But there are tunnels between minds, tunnels between hearts that we can tap into and that we don't believe we can do, or at least modern science doesn't, but we actually do. And you did it, Victor, and I've done it, and so have countless other people.
Absolutely. How have your peers reacted to this work?
With mostly benign neglect, which is worse than being criticized to some degree. There are a few psychiatrists who will cop to this. Will say, yeah, there's something going on with these meaningful coincidences. But when you ask me that question, I have to go about my colleagues, and I mean my psychiatric colleagues, I have to go over into the other side of this, namely that people who experience lots of coincidences like in a short period of time sometimes get overwhelmed by them and they go seek mental health help. Invariably, the mental health person wants to have some kind of antipsychotic prescribed. And what I'm trying to do and have tried to do in my book coming out September 6th, called Meaningful Coincidences, what I've tried to do there is saying that's not always the case. They're not always crazy. Some of them are, But some of them are people who've walked into a major life transition and need to use the coincidences to help guide themselves out. So when you ask me about my colleagues, that's where I start. Hey, come on, colleagues. You've got to recognize there could be something valuable about all these meaningful coincidences that some people have.
Let's start discussing the terms that are used for these experiences: coincidence, synchronicity, and serendipity. How do you define each of these terms? And do they describe the same thing or something different?
Oh, something different. Thank you for that question. The umbrella term is meaningful coincidence. Umbrella for both synchronicity and serendipity, as well as seriality, and as well as simulpathity, which I've just described. So the main ones are serendipity and synchronicity, which are in the title of my book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. They fall under the umbrella of meaningful coincidences, which the coming together of two or more events in a surprising, unexpected, and improbable way that seems to have significance to the person experiencing it, either at the moment or in retrospect, and may seem to have an explanation. That's coincidence. That's meaningful coincidence. And Jung came up with the word synchronicity. And Jung did not use the word synchronicity to mean a meaningful coincidence. He meant it to mean a way of explaining meaningful coincidences. But now synchronicity has become a term that covers a lot of different territories for a lot of different people. So serendipity and synchronicity are often used interchangeably. There's an overlap between the two. But for our purposes, Victor, I think it's worth defining synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence that is primarily related to interpersonal, psychological, and spiritual development. Interpersonal, psychological, and spiritual development are the main areas of synchronicity. Jung was a psychiatrist who did a lot of psychotherapy, so it shouldn't be any surprise that these three elements are part of the major definition of what synchronicity is.
And serendipity.
Serendipity, okay. Serendipity is usually finding things that you need without knowing how you found them, usually by accident. It's an accidental discovery of something that you were looking for, but you did it in a way that you didn't intend to find it that way. You were looking for something else, and you came up with this, or you're using another method to end up finding what you did find. The Nobel Prize winners, if you look at how they describe their findings, will often tell you they were happy accidents. One of the most obviously memorable ones involved the discovery of Viagra. So these guys, I think in England, were doing research, medical research, on a new antihypertensive, and also to help with angina. Well, the guys that they were giving it to really got mad when the researchers tried to withdraw the drug from them. They liked what it did to them. So they said, well, what did it do to you? Well, it made me more able to have erections. Now, they weren't looking for that, but they found it serendipitously. And then Viagra became one of the best-selling drugs ever.
Absolutely. So that's the happy accident.
Happy accidents are the simple way of describing serendipity. They're happy accidents, and there are a variety of other things that must come into play. You got to be alert to them and know what you're seeing. But the basic idea is happy accidents, and there's a book called Happy Accidents, which reviews, including Viagra, all the various ways pharmacological discoveries and other medical technical discoveries were made all by accident. Penicillin is one of the famous ones.
As we had mentioned, your book is entitled Meaningful Coincidences: How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. So is there such a thing as a non-meaningful or an unmeaningful coincidence?
Well, when we talk about meaningful coincidence, we also can talk about a different adjective in front of meaningful. There can be just a coincidence or a mere coincidence versus a meaningful coincidence. When it's just a coincidence, then it's just a coincidence, and so what? And when people use the term just a coincidence, they often are implying that it can be best explained by randomness, by chance. So this is one way of explaining coincidences, because once a coincidence is explained, if you recall in the definition, it may have an explanation. A meaningful coincidence may have an explanation. Once a meaningful coincidence has an explanation, it's no longer a coincidence because we know how it happened. And random people who insist that the only can be explained by random, all these meaningful coincidences, know that there are no coincidences because random explains them. And to me, one of the funniest things that happened was interviewing a guy who has a improbability study, of a way of measuring uncertainty in England at one of the big universities there. And he told me, Dr. Beitman, trying to understand explanations for meaningful coincidences is bad for your mental health.
And your response?
There's no response to that. The reason being, I'm a psychiatrist and I have a little idea about what mental health might have for it. But for him, it was difficult. But when I run into, and perhaps there's in our audience today, there are people who think it's only random. I can't argue with someone who says it's only random. I can't argue with people who say it's chance, because they know that is the explanation. And you've been doing this kind of work long enough, Victor, to know when people are caught up in a fixed idea, very, very difficult to change that fixed idea.
Absolutely. My guest is Dr. Bernard Beitman. His book, Meaningful Coincidences: How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Bernie, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and your work.
If you put my name in any web browser, Bernard Beitman MD, you'll come up with my website, which describes the book. The cover of the book has a spiral on it, a golden spiral. And that golden spiral was inspired by a snail shell and a spiral galaxy, which was to show that coincidences happen in the mundane world and they happen in the astronomical world, and they happen to us here in between. That website will describe what the book is about in more detail, and you can order it from the usual places, Amazon and Simon & Schuster, as well as my publisher, Inner Traditions.
And we'll be back with more of Dr. Bernard Beitman after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
back on Destination Unlimited. My guest this week, Dr. Bernard Beitman. His book is entitled Meaningful Coincidences: How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. What are some of the most common meaningful coincidences that you've uncovered?
As I mentioned, we put together the Weird Coincidence Survey and try to be able to answer that question. Well, actually, I was trying to answer the question, do they happen a lot? Do these weird coincidences happen a lot? This was 2006 that I put together this survey with the help of several research people. And the answers we came up with of the most common, I think of a question only to have it answered by an external source, like the radio, TV, or other people. Sometimes you hear somebody in another conversation and say what you needed to hear. It's kind of funny when that happens, but it's not uncommon. Radio, TV, internet now are places where questions get answered without your having to ask. That's a common weird coincidence or meaningful coincidence. Related to that is I think of an idea and hear or see it on the radio, TV, or internet. So here we're talking about mirroring your mind, where the media mirror what's in your mind. And I don't mean just some company trying to sell you something that they saw you or seem to be interested. I mean stuff that's important to you, ideas that you are thinking about, and then they are confirmed by what you see, hear in the media.
And what are some others?
I think of someone only to have that person unexpectedly contact me. People talk about this all the time. I was thinking of somebody and they called me, or they texted me. This is a very common one. And I advance in my work, career, education by being in the right place at the right time. Those are the four most common meaningful coincidences from our survey.
I'm going to share a quick story with you right now that sort of mirrors what you were talking about. As my listeners know, I was in the welding and equipment supply business for more than 42 years. In March of 2020, with the advent of COVID, the serious advent of COVID here in the United States and in the New York City area, most of my work involved face-to-face meetings with a lot of people. I was 67 years old at the time. My employer said, you know what? Most of your work is face-to-face with folks. We know that there's a danger, an inherent danger in someone of your age getting exposed to this virus. Why don't you take an early retirement? I said, not interested in an early retirement, but I understand what you're saying. I'll do it. And I did, and they were very generous to me, and that closed that book. The very same day, I had been a graduate of the New Seminary of New York in 1997, graduated and ordained an interfaith minister. That very day, I got a call from the current organization asking me to participate in an intensive that they were having that weekend and do some teaching, and I did. Then they said, you know, you never finished your Doctor of Ministry with the organization. Would you like to do that? I said, yes, and I did. Then they said, we're bringing back services online for the Interfaith Temple. Would you join us as Minister of Communication? I said, absolutely, and I did. And I was doing this, and it's wonderful work. We were based on donations, which unfortunately were not forthcoming. And in January of this year, a friend of mine in business called me and said, I need a project manager. Would you come to work for me? And I said, yes, I will. I did. One door closes, another door opens. This is what we're talking about.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. One of my faves along that line was a woman who wanted to be a singer in an opera. And she read about where the tryouts were for a part in this opera. And so she goes to the theater where they're doing the auditions, and she ended up for auditions. They were doing auditions for a musical. So she'd gotten the day wrong, right place, the wrong day. And they said, well, look, why don't you stick around and audition for this part in this musical? She did. And it was a much better role for her than being in the opera. Same idea. This time it was wrong place, wrong time, right place. one door closed and the other door opened for her because she showed up at the wrong time. These happen with some regularity. We talked earlier about this internal GPS. So I have this idea that she could sense intuitively that it was better for her to go on Saturday for the musical rather than on Sunday for the opera, without her actually having used her rational mind to do it. We have capacities in us that fall under the category of psi, of telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition that can enable us to make decisions without our conscious mind being involved. And those decisions sometimes lead us to where we need to be without knowing how we get there, or that we even chose to do it because it was done subconsciously. Probably one of the most dramatic versions of this was a person in our study group who were doing these weird coincidence surveys reported a story in which she, at age 19, 18, was very depressed. And she got in her car and she drove out to a lake in the woods someplace and had her father's gun with her. And she was sitting there thinking about blowing her brains out. And as she was doing that, another car pulled up, rolled down the window. It was her brother. What are you doing here? She said. He said, I don't know, but something made me come here. Well, you've never been here before. He said, I don't know, but I got here somehow. Here was an example of simulpathity where he could experience the pain of his distressed sister and then use his internal GPS to get where he needed to be to rescue her. These are common experiences, but we can't talk about them. So because I'm a psychiatrist and I'm supposed to know the difference between crazy and normal, I can say by my data and by my own personal experiences and people I talk with, that these stories, like this suicidal sister, represent actual capacities of human beings. The principle that I'm addressing here is that if one weird thing happens to you, I can think of, if I have some great idea, I can think, oh, I'm so special, I just thought of this. Well, I thought of this idea of simulpathity, for example, the pain of a loved one at a distance. And then I looked online a couple of years later, and I saw on Facebook a short film called Simulpathity. So I contacted the guy who was the producer on Facebook, and I said, have you seen my use of the word simulpathity? Because I really hadn't written it yet. I kind of wrote about it in some places, but not anything out there. He said, no, I never heard of you, or I never heard the word. He came up with it himself. Now that leads us to what is so evident if you look at the information, is that our minds are much more connected than we think they are. And they are in something that I call our mental atmosphere, which is full of energy and information. And we have contact with this psychosphere. And here he picked up some idea that I thought I was being real clever about on his own, because like a fish swimming in an ocean, he had hooked that fish a little sometime after I had, while it was still swimming around up there. This happens a lot. In 1922, a paper was published with hundreds of examples of what are called now independent simultaneous discoveries. And a couple of the funny ones include 1951, March 12th. What happened March 12th? Dennis the Menace, the famous cartoon character, was introduced to American audiences and to British audiences on the same day, and they were two different comic strips.
Wow.
Two different comic strips, same day, March 12th, 1951, Dennis the Menace introduced. Now, you say, well, okay, well, one of these guys, like, he plagiarized the other one. Well, a fairly careful newsletter called The Plagiarist looked into this, and the two cartoonists who developed these things didn't have any contact with each other. They hadn't had any communication. Now, you could also look that the two Dennises were very different and kind of reflected the cultures in which they were created. The American one at that time in 1951 was a bumbling a little kid, blonde and blue-eyed, and ran into trouble wherever he went. And he had a dog that went with him and got into trouble with him. The Dennis the Menace in England was a bad boy. He purposely caused trouble. And he had a dog that kind of helped him in the troublemaking. So they had somewhat different characters, but the idea was the same. Two little boys with a dog causing trouble.
So all of these that you're describing, you say coincidences are clues to the mysterious hiding in plain sight. Please explain.
In order to see something, you have to believe it exists. If you don't have a thing in your mind, a construct, an idea, a belief in your mind of what might be out there, it doesn't exist. And a famous story that I think may have been true or may not have been true, but illustrates the idea, was that a British clipper ship sailed into a bay in an island in the South Pacific. And the people who lived on the island there had never seen such a huge thing. So they acted as if it wasn't there. They were blind to it. They couldn't see it because they didn't have a concept of it. And that's the way it is with coincidences. If you don't believe meaningful coincidences are out there, you're not going to see them. So that's the first step. But the second step is pretty much what we've been talking about here, Victor, is that when you put the two Dennises together, that's a clue to how reality works. When you put the simultaneous discoveries of other people together, that's evidence that there are more ways that happens, like the simultaneous discovery of calculus, or on February 14th, 1876, lawyers for Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray walked into the U.S. Patent Office with the similar diagram describing the telephone. February 14th, 1876, 100 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, on Valentine's Day, these two guys, the lawyers of these two guys, say, hey, my guy has invented the telephone. How did that happen, that they both walked in the same day? Well, that gives us a clue about how things interact in ways that have patterns to them that we don't yet have good theories about how they happen. My book is an attempt to offer some models, some visuals about how simultaneous independent discoveries happen, as well as simulpathity, which you happen to you. I could then say happened to me. So here's two people that our listeners are hearing saying it happened to these two guys. That probably happens to other people. So in this way, the coincidences help us see the hidden that's hiding in plain sight.
Can this be extended to a different perspective? Can we say, if it's working that way, can it work in the opposite direction? Can collective consciousness affect something?
I think I know what you mean, Victor, and absolutely true, because the collective consciousness, which is included in the psychosphere. I think the collective consciousness is more related to simultaneous independent discoveries because there are people consciously working on these discoveries. But there's a collective subconscious and a collective unconscious, which Jung paid a lot of attention to. But once we put them all in the psychosphere, then we see not just my mind going out through the psychosphere to connect with your mind or with my father's mind. We see feedback loops between the psychosphere and our own minds. So the psychosphere influences us as we also influence the psychosphere. So yes, the general collective consciousness influences our mind. We know that so well from the way culture influences behavior and influences thought. It also goes on in more hidden ways, and Jung tried to describe them as archetypes, where there tend to be certain patterns of behavior that people get into across different populations. And when you talk about the correlations and the similarities among different religions, that's an example of different aspects of human thought sharing the same idea, and a feedback loop between those ideas and the religions lead to people like you and your organization trying to articulate those similarities, because those are so important in describing what we mean by religion and spirituality.
My guest is Dr. Bernard Beitman. His book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. We'll be back with more after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Dr. Bernard Beitman, his book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Are synchronicities something that happen only when we are paying attention, or are they always there even if we don't observe them?
Well, it's a little like that tree falling in the forest. If nobody observes them, is there a sound? And if there's a sound detector out there in the forest, then there is an observation being made. We don't have a coincidence observation thing happening, but I'll give you an example of where a coincidence that is evident if you look, but a lot of people don't notice, but it's there for everyone to see. And that is, look up in the sky, the sun and the moon. They are 93 million miles apart, but from where we stand, they look to be exactly the same size. What a coincidence. What a coincidence. A lot of people don't take notice of the fact that those two orbs up there in our sky are about the same size, and that's a coincidence that we can't explain. Right now, there are plenty of people who want to have explanations for it, but there it is right there. If you don't look, you're not going to see it. And I think for human beings, the purpose of having that sun-moon coincidences is to help us look more closely, be more aware of the meaningful coincidences in our life.
Are there those who are more prone to recognizing these things?
We did the research to try to answer that question, Victor. The fundamental similarity among those who saw a lot of them was a willingness to examine their own thinking and while comparing it to thinking to events outside their own mind. So people who do a lot of word idea processing, not too much, are more likely to find matches in their environment if they were looking for them. But first, before you ever will see coincidences, you've got to have one to know they exist. Now, Victor and I are telling you all that they exist. He's got them. I've got them. You have them in your lives. And you will find that if you ask some of your friends, they will tell you about coincidences in their lives. It's just not part of our conversation. So one way to increase your coincidence frequency is to tell people coincidence stories. They're likely to be telling you their own coincidence story back. And that is the purpose, the main purpose of the Coincidence Project, of which I am the president and founder, to be able to increase coincidence storytelling in order for people to see and hear more experiences with each other. So you have to believe that they exist. Then you have to believe that it's worth paying attention to them. And yeah, I'll be doing a little selling here, but you'll find out yourself. You heard about Victor having gotten some jobs by coincidences, and me too. I haven't talked about them, but they are helpful in lots of ways, including finding things that you need, as well as finding relationships and establishing them, as well as developing your spiritual capacity. You need to be able to see that those are potential usefulnesses of coincidence. And when you start doing that, you'll begin to believe that maybe they are useful. So once you start believing they're useful, that is, they're meaningful in a practical way, then you might get curious about them. You won't see a coincidence unless you're paying attention. You got to pay attention to what's going on in your own mind while also paying attention to what's going on around you. And when you do that, you have to have the capacity and the willingness to notice similarities. Now, how similar is similar becomes a question. Some people talk about two things being similar, and other people would say they're not. Computers are being programmed to be able to judge similarity digitally, but we use our own analogical brain to be able to see how similar things are. So if you judge two things to be similar, then you're on the way to seeing a coincidence, especially if you can't explain it.
Now, someone has a series of coincidences, meaningful coincidences, and they turn into a situation where they meet this person they've always been looking for. They fall in love, they get married, and a day later they're done. Do these things always work out with happy endings or no?
There are those who would have you believe, Victor, that they all turn out with happy endings. And in my book, you will see stories in which coincidences are good for one person and not good for the other person, or a coincidence is good for you now and is not good for you later, or vice versa. You have to look at them over time. So they are not always wonderful. And that's the incorrect sell job that people who talk about synchronicity tend to push on people. They aren't. And one of the most popular of my Psychology Today posts, I have about 100 posts in there with about 1 million viewers. So some of them get pretty popular. And one of the most popular ones is, does this coincidence mean it's meant to be? Just like you're bringing up. And so the subtitle of that is, oh, those tricky false promise coincidences, because some of these are false promises. A simple example is a guy who was famous for a while, was on Fox News and then not on Fox News, was on an airplane sitting next to a guy, and they got into a chat, a real good one. They had a great time, and it turned out the guy he was talking with was the boss of the guy who was going to just make the hiring decisions about this ex-Fox News guy. So he thought, wow, I had a good connection with the boss. I'm going to get hired. Well, you can hear from where I'm saying this, no. And so he doesn't want his name to be known because it was like embarrassing because he thought it was going to work out. It was meant to be, but it wasn't. When you get down to relationships, I've talked with people who've had wonderful beginnings, the love and love and love, and so all these coincidences are happening. And we met on a beach, and I was by myself, and he rode up on his motorcycle, and we just came together, and it was a wonderful thing. And in order for any relationship to continue, there's something called working on the relationship. So I've talked with people who have had marvelous coincidences, but they didn't work on the relationship because they thought the coincidences would help them through the rough times. No. Some of these, they do work on the relationship, but it does end. And the ending, the marriage ending, a woman said, I'm so grateful for the 15 years I got to spend with him because we had two wonderful children. And now I'm having a career of my own that he helped me develop. So I'm fine. And he was not so happy with it. But there it was, one person good, one person not.
Are these meant to also give us a learning experience if we're aware enough to learn from them?
Yes, sir. That's what they're there for. They're here to kind of say, look, okay, we're here. We happen. Meaningful coincidences happen. But what does it tell you about you? And what does it tell you about the nature of reality? And most important in my work is what does it tell you about the invisible threads that connect and unite us? Because coincidences highlight, illuminate the hidden currents that connect and unite us. And that's a fundamental driver of the Coincidence Project, to increase people's awareness of how you can pick up your mother's distress. You picked up your mother's distress and at great distance. How does that happen? Well, we are more connected than we know. And that's part of the learning experience. People say, it's all one, we're all connected. No, I want to find out how we're connected because it's much more dynamic. It changes a lot. I want to be able to help people see that we are all interconnected, but in a dynamic way that we have to pay attention to and be able to understand how to use.
One of the things through personal experience has been that if something happens in a positive way for me, it has to meet two rules. Number one, it has to be for what I call my highest good, but it cannot detract from the other person's highest good. Is that something you also see?
I hope so, but it's not true of coincidences. Sometimes it's good for one person and sometimes not so good for another person.
Absolutely. Please tell us about the Coincidence Project that you've been talking about.
Well, through, you might expect, a coincidence. I met Juliet Trail here in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we kept a friendship going for like 4 years or so. And then one day she moved on from her job at the University of Virginia. And I had written a book on coincidences, called Connecting with Coincidence. And I was ready to try to create an organization that studied meaningful coincidences. So I said, Juliet, you think you might want to help me with this? She's really multi-talented. And she said, yeah. So she has helped me create a nonprofit, the Coincidence Project, with 10 board members, trying to be able to find the money and find the people and find the programs that and define the research and define the connectedness that we have with other people so that we can increase the likelihood that people will tell each other their coincidence stories. Again, our vision is to illuminate the hidden currents that connect and unite us. And part of that mission is to facilitate the coincidence ambassadors in our group to doing their thing, because we have people in our group, and there are many others outside who are trying to be able to say their coincidences are really important. Meaningful coincidences are happening a lot. Pay attention to them. They're important to us. They're important to humanity. And we want to help other people do that, as well as get our group strong enough to be able to create online classes and to have what we call coincidence cafes. Come to the Coincidence Cafe. You can have serendipity.
His book is called Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Dr. Bernard Beitman, please tell our listeners one more time how they can get your books and find out more about you.
Well, Bernard Beitman, put me into your web browser, and it'd be great if you take a look at my Psychology Today posts and my podcast, both called Connecting with Coincidence. But the primary thing now is my book, Meaningful Coincidences. And it is the best book on meaningful coincidence ever written. Why do I say that? Because I encompass in this book the broad areas that are part of the studying of meaningful coincidences, from definitions to how to use them, to breaking coincidences down into subcategories, to being able to explain the different explanations for coincidences. And at the end, I try to suggest that meaningful coincidences allow each of us to find our purpose in life.
Thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.